everybody, I'm Jed, and this is Prez. Hey guys, we're hitting you with another episode of Prez, episode 5. We're starting into the territory that they're getting less and less bad and more into the middle ground territory. It might surprise you to see that JFK is going to show up somewhere in this episode, but we'll get to him later. Let's start off with number 1. Starting off today with John Quincy Adams. He was our 6th president. He was a Democratic Republican, and he was president from 1825 to 1829. John Quincy Adams might surprise you to hear his name because John Quincy Adams are two different dudes. John Quincy Adams was John Adams, our 2nd president's son. They were the first president father-son duo, followed much later by the Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. John Quincy Adams was very depressed by this because he never felt accomplished, which is really crazy. You're like, he was president. And not only was he president, but he served in Congress before he was president, and he is, to this day, the only president who served in Congress even after he was president. He became a representative in the House and actually died working in the House of Representatives afterwards. But yeah, he never felt accomplished because he felt like he couldn't live up to his father, which is really sad to hear. So he was depressed like all day long, every day. One last thing I'd like to shed light on before we move on to our next president was a little embarrassing for him. It's not anything to do with it was during his presidency, but I'll just get right to it. He thought the earth was hollow and that there were mole men inside of it. That's right. You heard me right, guys. He had a friend who believed that the earth was hollow and that inside there were mole men who we needed to get to and trade with. We're keeping on trucking with Grover Cleveland. He was our 22nd and 24th president. It'll make sense in a little bit. He was a Democrat. You may get confused when you hear, why are you giving us 2 numbers, Jed? Well, Grover Cleveland ran for president and got it, but then he was trumped out of the presidency by somebody else who worked their way in, Benjamin Harrison. We'll get to him a little later. And then Grover Cleveland ran again and got back in. So 2 different terms, 2 different administrations or presidencies, but it was the same guy. The thing with Grover Cleveland is there are a long line starting with, I'd say, Rutherford B. Hayes and going on until around Teddy Roosevelt, of just this long line of bearded presidents who were big on reform and not much else. They were good presidents. They had provided good, steady leadership, and they were a good guide through times following Reconstruction. But there wasn't much going on other than reform. And Grover Cleveland was probably the most boring of all of these middle presidents. Grover Cleveland, he was stubborn like John Quincy Adams in the sense that he would not move on on some issues, which probably led to him having 2 different terms. More people got sick of him, and then they're, yeah, we want him back. He did want reform in terms of, the workforce and making sure that people were being paid correctly and making sure that the spoil system in the government was stopped. But there wasn't as much going on. But he did provide steady leadership, and that's something we always need in a president. But even though nothing was really going on with his presidency, we will always remember Grover Cleveland as the only president, up until now, who served 2 non-consecutive terms. Up next is Lyndon B. Johnson. He was our 36th president. He was a Democrat, and he was president from 1963 to 1969. Lyndon B. Johnson followed right after JFK's untimely assassination, and he used JFK's devastating death to pass many forms of legislation, pushing what he called the Great Society. This is another Nixon situation. There's good and there's bad. But lucky for us, the good came first and the bad came last. So my general tendency to put the good and then the bad will work out here. But like I said, just what I was just saying, the Great Society was pushing for everyone being equal, the government not taxing the people as much and not spending as much, and basically everybody being happy and neighborly to one another, having America to be one great big neighborhood where everybody's friends. And this actually worked pretty well at first. His greatest accomplishment and one of the greatest presidential feats of all time was passing the civil rights legislation, which was groundbreaking, monumental, and mind-blowing how amazing and awesome this is. It's so great that this happened. And really, Lyndon B. Johnson was just the man for the job. He could pass laws and bills like nobody's business. This was definitely a groundbreaker because he passed more laws in his presidency than any other president. He was kind of a jerk about it, though, because in order to pass laws, he would get in the face of congressmen and spit at them and belittle them in order to pass legislation. And he would even have people talk to him while he pooped in order to intimidate them to pass legislation. So even though he was a little bit of a jerk while doing it, he was able to get a lot of stuff done that was really good for the people and really good for the government in a whole as itself at home. Now on to the bad stuff. As many of you know, and those who don't, you're here to learn. Lyndon B. Johnson was president during the Vietnam War. He wasn't the president who originally put boots on the ground. That helm goes to Eisenhower/Kennedy. It was kind of towards where they were switching tenures as president. But it was really Lyndon B. Johnson who took the full measure and sent more troops to Vietnam. He did this because we were in what we called the Cold War between us and the Soviet Union, where we didn't want any more communism spreading. North Vietnam and South Vietnam were in a civil war because North Vietnam wanted to take control of South Vietnam and make it a communist state. We had to stand against this because if this happened, we would look like pansies and the Soviet Union could walk all over us. The bad part is we went a little overboard with this. Even though it was good for us to have a little bit of presence there, Lyndon B. Johnson took it way too far in sending too many troops and keeping them there way too long. Casualties skyrocketed, and Lyndon B. Johnson eventually knew that he needed to get them out, but he just didn't have the kind of foreign policy, diplomatic skills that were really required of that kind of magnitude. When you really look at his presidency, he was very good at home in terms of the economy and, making sure the Constitution was completely filled out by all citizens. But abroad, his foreign policy, how we deal with wars and foreign countries, left something to be desired. So he was very good at home, but abroad, not so much. Next up, finally, closing up our episode is John F. Kennedy, JFK, number 35. He was a Democrat, and he was president from 1961 to 1963. JFK is remembered as a very inspiring leader, and he really was. He inspired a lot of young people to get interested in the government, to make sure that they believed in and knew what their leaders were doing. Even though he was an inspiration to many and was able to push the space program to new heights, there are a couple sags in his administration that need to be looked at it a little bit further. Now, having said this, a lot of the bad sags that happened in his presidency, he was able to fix, which is something a lot of presidents can't do. The first one of these, and probably the most extreme, was the Bay of Pigs / the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me set the stage.
So essentially, Cuba was under communist control by a monarch by the name of Fidel Castro, and essentially the Soviet Union wanted Cuba to remain extremely communist and extremely powerful because of how close they were to the United States. And so the communists were sending missiles down into Cuba, setting them up so they had easy range to get to America. And so JFK sees this and he goes, we need to stop this. But rather than using the Monroe Doctrine, which we'll get to later, and sending in troops, he funds and supports and essentially equips a bunch of refugee rebellion force that's trying to overthrow Cuba in a little outclove called the Bay of Pigs to try and take over Cuba by using military force. But the attack goes horribly wrong. The rebellion fighters get destroyed, dominated. But before this, JFK was very adamantly supporting it. And then the U.S. is extremely embarrassed, and it's become this global scandal, and JFK looks really bad, and because of this, the Soviet Union sends in more missiles. So JFK really put himself in a tough position by sending in the attack, having it not work, and having to see the repercussions of that.
So now that this is happening, JFK is really scared, and like I said, it gets even worse. So the Soviet Union sees this and they go, that's not good, because we want Cuba to stay communist, and if the United States is trying to get in there, we gotta do something. So the Soviet Union puts a bunch of missiles on boats and stuff in planes, and they send them to Cuba and set up a giant missile base or military base there. And they think we don't know about it, but then one of our spy planes goes over and gets some photos and brings it to JFK. And JFK's like, oh gosh, why did this have to happen to me? Because this is awful. This is a nightmare. Like, there's accounts of him, like, his Secret Servicemen just finding him weeping in the White House because, like, it's so hard. But he gets down to business. He's like, we need to fix this. We need to fix this. So this is where he does a good job. He orders a blockade around Cuba of American ships. And it essentially becomes this stalemate where we're both looking at each other with our missiles like, come at me, you do it, come on. Like a game of cat and mouse waiting for the other to strike. And eventually the Russians pull off and take their missiles out of Cuba. Even though JFK's presidency was fairly short because of his assassination, bummer, you could easily break his presidency into two parts. Because in the beginning, he was still an amateur, you might say. He didn't really know what he was doing because he was very young. He was the youngest elected president. But after the Bay of Pigs and the way he was able to use firm leadership in order to fix it, he was a strong leader. There are a couple things that he wasn't able to get done that he really wanted to do, like the space race. And he wanted to pass civil rights to get segregation ended, which he wasn't able to finish. But he was able to do a lot of good even still. Like, ending the Bay of Pigs fiasco was a huge victory for him, even though he kind of caused it. And him pushing for us to go to the moon was another huge victory. But the fact is, sadly, the fact is a lot of his victories were making up for mistakes that he had already made. So while JFK is fondly remembered for being an inspiration to many and being a voice for young government politicians everywhere, maybe your view of him changed after hearing some of his accomplishments and missteps. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed episode 5, and I hope you liked my telling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Make sure to subscribe, to like, to share, comment below, and make sure to tell all your friends about Prez, because we got more content coming on the way, and we love cranking out these episodes for you guys.